Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the final hours of a queen, a woman forgotten by her own people, haunted by the weight of her faith, and slowly rotting from the inside out. You've probably heard the name Bloody Mary, maybe in a ghost story, maybe while playing that mirror summoning game. But what if I told you the truth behind that name is far more terrifying and far more heartbreaking? Imagine a sealed room in a royal palace, dimly lit, heavy with incense, velvet curtains soaked in rosewater to mask another smell, the stench of decay. Outside, the kingdom is changing hands. Inside, a woman is dying, not just from illness, but from everything history refused to forgive her for. Tonight, we're not just talking about royal politics or the Reformation. We're talking about the slow unraveling of a person. A queen, the first woman to rule England in her own right. A woman whose skin blackened before death, who was pregnant twice but bore no children, and whose name has echoed through centuries with both fear and misunderstanding. A story of fire, loss, and silence. And just a little warning, you might not sleep so well after this one. But hey, you clicked on it, so now you're in. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't hesitate to leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I'd really love to know who's awake with me in these late hours. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The night wind gently slips through the old bars of St. James's Palace, carrying with it the damp scent of stone walls, the fading lavender in silver jars, and if you're perceptive, the smell of death slowly making its entrance. You lie there, silent in the dark, and so does Mary Tudor. Only she is dying in a lavish but cold room, where flickering candles aren't warm enough for someone the world has already turned away from. Did you know that when she was young, Mary was called the Pearl of the Kingdom by her father, King Henry VIII? A clever girl, fluent in Latin, a talented musician, and destined to be a diplomatic gem at just 2 years old. She was betrothed to the future Holy Roman Emperor. In modern times, she'd probably be invited to speak at TEDx, or at least be a straight-A student with national honors, right? But the wedding never happened. And from a proud princess, Mary became an outcast when her father annulled his marriage to her mother, Queen Catherine of Aragon, to wed another woman, Anne Boleyn. From that point on, Mary's life played out like a Netflix family drama, the kind with a 16+ age warning for excessive emotional damage. Stripped of her title, forced to serve her half-sister, forbidden to see her mother. And if you think your parents were unfair, sometimes, trust me, Mary wins this game. Here's a lesser-known fact. Mary never saw her mother again after their separation. Catherine died alone, in isolation. And that, according to some modern psychologists, might have been the first seed that tied Mary's sense of despair to duty, honor, and her unwavering Catholic faith. That girl grew up believing one unshakable thing. If she suffered, if she remained loyal to her faith, God would ultimately be just. Unfortunately, politics never plays by the rules of Catholicism. When her half-brother, King Edward VI, died, Mary entered a battle for the throne against her cousin Jane Grey. And guess what? Mary won. Not just won, she was hailed as a savior. For the first time in history, a woman was crowned Queen of England, not as a king's wife, not as a king's mother, but as a queen in her own right. It's kind of like finally getting that promotion after years of grinding, only to realize the new job comes with twice the stress. The problem was, Mary didn't see ruling as just a political responsibility. She saw it as a divine mission. She believed God had chosen her to restore England to Catholicism. And so, you guessed it, things started to burn. Literally. Over 280 Protestants were executed over a period of 3 years. Among them were pastors, nobles, and even ordinary villagers, all because they refused to renounce their beliefs. And here's the part where historians still argue, was Mary truly cruel, or simply a product of her time? Some modern scholars argue that, compared to her father Henry VIII, who executed wives and clerics alike, the death toll under Mary was still modest. A chilling way to put it, I know. But let's set that debate aside for now. Because the most tragic part of Mary's life wasn't the burnings, it was her own body. betraying her at the moment she needed it most. In 1554, she married Philip II of Spain, believing he would help her produce an heir, secure the throne, and continue the Catholic line. But Philip was, well, to put it gently, not that into it. And to be honest, he just kept going on long business trips and never really came back. What happened next was a string of events so bizarre that if they happened to you, you might also suspect the universe was playing a cruel joke. Mary believed she was pregnant. The entire court celebrated. Doctors confirmed it. A birthing chamber was prepared, but no baby ever came. Her belly slowly shrank. A false pregnancy, also called a phantom pregnancy, was enough to stir whispers across the palace. But Mary had two of them. If it were today, she'd probably be the subject of a deep dive psychology video titled Trauma, Motherhood, and the Wounds That Never Healed. Shazam. From that moment on, illness began to eat away at Mary like termites in a stone wall. Chronic headaches, swollen legs, rashes, skin that turned yellow, then purple, then blackened. Her attendants had to change the bedsheets daily because her body gave off such a strong odor, a smell described as if death was leaking from every pore. And do you know what keeps me haunted by this story? It's that Mary, even as everything crumbled around her, still tried to pray, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. She didn't ask God to erase her sins. She just wanted to know why. Why did faith lead her to the edge of such agony? You might not agree with Mary. You might find her superstitious, fanatical, or even terrifying. But if you've ever stayed up all night feeling like the world had forgotten you, then you'll understand just a little the loneliness Mary died with. Can you still hear the candle burning, the soft flicker at the bedside, where Mary lay, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if searching for a crack in heaven to slip through? But there was no crack. Only the whispers of servants, the rustle of silk as they turned her frail body, and the faint moans of flesh decaying by the hour. By this time, Mary could no longer walk on her own. She was carried on a stretcher, like a wax figure melting in the sun. Her room was always shut tight, heavy drapes blocking out every ray of light, not for royal privacy, but out of fear of her own reflection. The mirrors had been removed from the walls. Can you imagine that? Not out of vanity, but because she couldn't bear to see her face anymore. A servant later recalled, in one of the rare times they entered her room, that she looked like a ghost wrapped in velvet. Her skin mottled black, gray, and blue, especially on her abdomen, back, and under her arms. Doctors at the time called it internal gangrene. But if you ask me, it was the body of someone so tired it had decided to stop living. People still debate today. Did Mary die of ovarian cancer? Liver disease? Edema complicated by chronic depression? Historians don't agree. Some scholars lean toward a hereditary illness called porphyria, which can cause hallucinations, psychosis, and changes in skin color. Sounds like a royal curse. Then again, maybe it was. I'm no doctor, but if you lived in a world where your husband abandoned you, your children never came, your people resented you, and history gave you the name Bloody, you might fall ill too. One of the strangest, least known facts. In her final days, Mary asked for a crucifix to be brought to her bed. Not just any crucifix, but the one her mother had kept while in exile. A final sacred object, a last walking stick, something of home. And here, we return to the beginning. Her mother. There were nights when Mary called out Catherine's name, not in prayer, but like a child speaking in a dream. You didn't leave me, you died innocent, but I did not. The servants heard every word, but none dared to speak. It was no longer about politics, no longer about religion. It was the bare soul of a woman facing death, and everything she had done, trying to live with meaning. A sad story, deeply sad, but also deeply true, deeply human. You see, powerful women in history are often remembered as symbols, goddesses, witches, saints, or monsters. But rarely do people remember that they were afraid, that they hurt, that they, too, were once someone's little girl. And by now, are you breathing a little steadier? If so, that's good. But don't fall asleep just yet, because the ending is still waiting. In the early hours of the 17th of November, 1558, in a room with only a few attendants keeping watch, Mary Tudor lifted herself one last time. No one could hear what she said, Her lips moved silently, as if calling a name or saying goodbye to someone no longer there. And then, silence. No scream, no final words. Just one last breath melting into the cold air. The ladies in waiting stood frozen. One leaned in and kissed her forehead, avoiding the necrotic patches. Another gently closed her eyes. There were no church bells ringing in that moment. No applause, no grand ritual. She died in silence, just as she had lived, between prayers and shadows. The bitter irony? The one who took the throne after her was Elizabeth, the younger sister she once called a heretic. A Protestant queen who rewrote England's history and completely overshadowed Mary's name in her own light. Later, when they were buried together at Westminster Abbey, the inscription on their shared tomb read, "Two sisters in the same royal throne and in the same grave, awaiting resurrection." But if you visit that spot today and look closely, you'll see that the name Elizabeth is gilded in shining gold, while Mary is etched faintly, sunken into the stone. A little sad, isn't it? But maybe on a night like this, as you lie in the calm darkness, the air just a little cold, Mary might feel a little less alone. Because someone, even just for one night, remembers her not as Bloody Mary, but as Mary, a woman, a soul, a story worth telling. The December wind that year was sharp as needles, cold enough that they said even the stone statues at Westminster Abbey cracked. In that air, a lead-lined coffin was quietly brought into the chapel. No drums, no trumpets, no fanfare, no crowds lining the streets like they had when she was crowned. And you know what? That was the funeral of a Queen of England. A funeral so strange that if you hadn't read the history books, you might think it was for some minor noble, not for someone who once sat on the throne, who once killed, and was once hailed with church bells and incense. Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, the first woman to rule England in her own name, was now just a body, hurriedly buried in silence. Because, if they delayed, the corpse would smell too strong for anyone to bear. Remember, she had already begun to decay even while alive. Those who prepared her funeral, monks, servants, a few remaining loyal officials, had to cover their faces with scented cloth to work. Perfume was poured on the body, herbs stuffed into the shroud, and the coffin lined with lead to trap the stench. But it was all symbolic. That smell of rot, like an inevitable ending, clung to the stone walls, the velvet curtains, and the memories of those who witnessed it. Her body was wrapped in several layers of waxed cloth. No silk gown, no crown, no royal emblems. Just a broken body, tightly bound, placed in a coffin heavy as fate. And then, the procession began. But don't picture lines of mourners or long chants of prayer. The truth is, aside from religious officials and the bare minimum of ceremonial presence, Mary's funeral was nearly empty. The public didn't come to say goodbye. They were too busy preparing for the coronation of her successor, Elizabeth. There's something curious that few people notice. During that funeral, one of Mary's long-serving maids secretly took a pinch of ash from her chamber and hid it in a small pouch inside her sleeve. No one knows why. Maybe it was to keep something of a woman who had once been queen, or maybe it was to stop her spirit from being completely forgotten. Mary's coffin was laid to rest inside the Henry VII Chapel, a sacred, solemn place. But not one meant just for her. No sculpted effigy, no raised royal seal, just a plain stone slab marking the burial. And it wasn't until years later, after Elizabeth died, that a joint inscription was carved onto their shared tomb. Partners in throne and grave. Here lie two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of the resurrection. Sounds fair enough. But if you go there today and look closely, you'll see the name Elizabeth is gilded in bright gold, while Mary is only faintly carved, like the shadow of someone erased from memory. Historians still debate it today. Was Mary's rushed, cold funeral a result of hatred, or did the new court simply want to erase a chapter they considered a mistake? Some records say even the priest rushed through the final prayers because he couldn't stand the smell. Honestly, if you've ever had a birthday party no one showed up to, you might understand the feeling. But Mary's was worse. She died a queen, but was buried like someone to be forgotten. And perhaps the most heartbreaking thing is, even in death, she found no peace. Her name, Bloody Mary, became a legend, a children's game, a midnight curse in front of a mirror. No one tells stories about her loyalty, her relentless faith. People only remember fire and blood. You see, there are funerals that are grand, radiant, filled with flowers and music. And then there are funerals like the way Mary left this world, in silence, in darkness, and with a sadness so heavy, no one dares speak her name. Only you, listening in the late hours of this night, still remember. And sometimes, just one person remembering is enough. And you know what? Among all the ghosts that hovered around Mary Tudor's death, there was one who never left her. Even after the blood stopped flowing, after the final candle burned out. It wasn't her husband. It wasn't the people. It was her mother, Catherine of Aragon. If you've ever had a mother who believed in you, even when the whole world turned away, then you'll understand why the image of Catherine was etched so deeply into Mary's mind, like a carving that would never fade. Even on her deathbed, Mary whispered, "You didn't abandon me. You died innocent, but I did not." A confession, a silent cry from a child forced to grow up too fast. But what happened to Catherine? Why did a woman who was once Queen of England, the lawful wife of Henry VIII, end up dethroned, cast out of the palace as if she had never existed? The story begins, like so many royal tragedies, with a promise and a womb that never grew large enough. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, the same monarchs who funded Columbus's voyage. She was married into the English royal family to secure a Catholic alliance between two great powers. At first, she was wed to Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII. But Arthur died young, only a few months after the wedding, and so another marriage was arranged. Catherine married Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII. Here's the issue. The church at the time forbade marrying your brother's widow, but Catherine swore that she and Arthur had never consummated their marriage, and the Pope accepted her oath. Thus, the marriage was deemed valid. Henry and Catherine were together for nearly 20 years, and during those 2 decades, Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times. Only one child survived, Mary. Now, put yourself in Henry's shoes. As a king, he believed his right to rule came from God, and if he had no son, clearly the fault couldn't be his. It had to be his wife's. And clearly, he had to fix the problem by marrying someone else. Into Anne Boleyn. Young, charming, intelligent, and most importantly, unmarried. Henry was infatuated. But there was a small problem. Well, actually a huge one. To marry Anne, Henry had to divorce Catherine. And since the Catholic Church wouldn't allow it, he did something unprecedented in English history. He created his own church. Yes, a new religion, just to get divorced. Catherine, steadfast and unyielding, refused to give up the title of queen. She never admitted to being a former wife, never agreed to go quietly. And the price for that defiance was exile from court, separation from her daughter, and a life of cold, isolated decline. During those years, Mary was forbidden to see her mother. They were only allowed to write letters, and sometimes, even those were censored or destroyed. Mary became the illegitimate child. Catherine became a nuisance. Here's a little-known detail. In her final days, Catherine lived in an old monastery, where the curtains were torn and there was not enough heat. Yet she prayed every day, and in her final letter to Henry, she offered no scolding, no bitterness. She simply wrote, "In this life, I was your wife. In death, I remain the one who loved you most." If your heart aches a little hearing that, you're not alone. Historians today are still divided in how they view Catherine. Some see her as stubborn, rigid, and out of step with the times. Others regard her as a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and unshakable belief in personal honor. And Mary? She never forgave the humiliation her mother endured. And from that wound, a part of Mary's steely and sometimes ruthless nature was born. Because when a person is forced to choose between love and honor, and both are taken away, what remains is a slow-burning rage that lasts a lifetime. And you see, tonight, as we speak Catherine's name again, under soft lights, with the fan humming gently, perhaps, somewhere far away, Mary is smiling. Not because the pain is gone, but because her mother is still remembered. And if you've ever lost sleep thinking of your mother, even on a quiet, rainy night, then you'll understand why Mary never stepped out from Catherine's shadow. Her mother was not just a memory, she was the core of Mary's identity, the source of her sorrow, and the measure by which all right and wrong in her turbulent life was judged. Catherine did not die as a queen, but as an exile in a damp fortress, clutching a worn rosary, eyes turned toward the place where she once held her daughter. When news of her death reached Mary, the young woman knelt in her room, grasped her mother's crucifix, and did not speak a single word for hours. You see, some losses make people cry out, but some pains leave you so silent, even time itself grows cautious. And from that moment on, Mary became someone else. No longer the pearl of the kingdom, as Henry had once fondly called her. No longer the princess who played music, spoke 3 languages, or smiled at banquets. She became someone who lived for only 2 things: her mother's honor and the Catholic faith. The tragedy was both were being crushed under the weight of the new court. Mary was forced to sign a declaration renouncing Catholicism. She refused. Stripped of her inheritance, still refused. Forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman her mother believed had shattered a sacred marriage. And guess what? Mary still refused to bend. We're talking about a woman living in the 16th century, where men didn't just hold power, they defined what was reasonable. And Mary, branded illegitimate, stubborn, became a thorn in the side of every ruler after Henry, from her brother Edward VI to his advisors. Here's a little-known fact. As a young woman, Mary held secret Catholic masses in her private chamber, using forbidden candles and banned Latin missals. She sent messages to Rome, appealed to Catholic monarchs across Europe, and if that sounds minor, then you've never lived in a kingdom where faith could get you burned alive. And then, when the moment came, Mary didn't hesitate. In 1553, when Edward VI died and the reformists tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, Mary rose up. No more silence. She wrote letters, rallied soldiers, gathered noblemen, and within days, the eastern countryside of England stood with her. And do you know what was miraculous? She didn't need a bloody battle. The people welcomed her. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, crying, waving handkerchiefs. They didn't just see Mary as the rightful heir. They saw in her someone who had suffered like they had, waited like they had, and now would restore the order that had been overturned. And so Mary, at the age of 37, became the first Queen of England crowned in her own right. You might think, here it is, the happy ending. But no, this was merely the overture to a tragedy deeper than the scent of incense in her sick room. Because when you spend your whole life waiting for a single chance, that chance often comes too late. When you're exhausted, when faith starts to curdle into fear, and when the shadow of your mother, even as inspiration, becomes a burden you can no longer put down. Mary stepped onto the throne, but she never stepped out from the haunting presence of Catherine. She ruled not only with a crown, but with a crucifix that weighed heavily on her shoulders. And she began to govern not just with faith, but with the fury of all those years spent kneeling in the dark. If you've ever thought pain makes us who we are, then Mary is the proof, and also the warning. And then, after years of living in the shadow of her mother, in shame, under guarded meals and whispered prayers behind locked doors, Mary finally rose. No longer the outcast, no longer the illegitimate child, or the thorn in the court side, but the Queen of England, ascending the throne amid ringing bells and the cheers of the people. Imagine being Mary at that moment, standing on the balcony of Whitehall Palace, dressed in deep red robes embroidered with gold, looking down at a sea of faces chanting your name. Those who once avoided your gaze now bow their heads. The nobles who once whispered behind your back now swear allegiance. And in that moment, perhaps, a voice echoed inside Mary. Do you see this, Mother? I did it. But you know, what comes after glory is rarely gilded. From the very beginning of her reign, Mary did not see the crown as a personal victory, but as a divine mission. She believed she wasn't just chosen by Tudor blood, but by God, literally. And the first thing this chosen one did was correct what she saw as heresy, which meant restoring Catholicism, erasing the Reformation, and inevitably, hunting down heretics. But wait, before you shudder at the phrase burned alive, try to see Mary as a real leader. She wasn't merely a woman ruled by emotion. She was a strategist. The first thing she did was stabilize the court. Mary retained several officials from Edward VI's reign to avoid shocking the administrative system. She pardoned some former opponents, hoping for reconciliation. She asked Parliament to re-legitimize her parents' marriage, which, legally speaking, was akin to asking an entire nation to rewrite its collective memory. And, surprisingly, she succeeded. But then, the greatest problem appeared: succession. Mary had no husband, no child, and a monarchy can't survive on faith alone. An heir was needed. So she turned to Spain, where one man held the attention of all of Europe: Philip II, son of Charles V, Emperor of the vast Habsburg Empire. On paper, it sounded like a smart political move, an alliance with Spain, backed by the Pope, securing Catholic power. But unfortunately, the heart of England disagreed. The people were angry. Parliament was uneasy. There were fears that England would become a Spanish vassal, that church bells would toll in strange rhythms, and that decisions would soon be written in Castilian, not English. Mary, however, was blind, not just politically, but seemingly emotionally. She truly believed Philip would love her, would give her a child, would carry forward her mother's dream of a Catholic, harmonious, God-blessed England. And so they married. A grand wedding, full of pageantry. But behind the red velvet curtains was a cold truth. Philip was distant, detached, treating Mary like an obligation. 6 months later, he left England. No promise, no farewell kiss. Mary stayed behind and began to believe she was pregnant. The palace was abuzz. Baby clothes were sewn, a cradle was readied, a name for the prince was drafted. But as you already know, no child ever came. Her belly slowly deflated, and with it, her faith collapsed once again. And perhaps it was from that personal failure that Mary's fury began to burn more visibly. If she couldn't birth a child, she would birth a Catholic England, no matter the cost. That's when the executions began. Over 280 people were burned, pastors, scholars, even common villagers. And not in secret, the burnings were public, in marketplaces, on roadsides, as warnings. Some sang hymns as they burned. Some held their children and refused to recant their faith. And the tragic thing is, Mary didn't do it out of cruelty. She truly believed she was saving their souls, that if they died in flames, at least they might live forever with God. Modern historians still argue about this. Some view Mary as a blind zealot. Others see her as a product of her time, a world where forgiveness only came after you died. And you? What do you think? Even so, if you look beyond the fires and the throne, you'll see a woman desperately trying to control a kingdom that was no longer the one she knew. Protestantism wasn't just doctrine. It had rooted itself in the people's minds. And Mary, no matter how many heretics she burned, could not burn away a changing history. She came to power hoping to heal, but ruled with the fear of losing everything. A fear lit by fire, and ended in darkness. If you're still awake, and I imagine you might be lying on your side, hand under your pillow, eyes half closed to the slow spin of the fan, then let me take you a little deeper into a lesser-known part of Mary's story, the politics of her reign. You see, ruling a country after decades of religious upheaval, ideological civil wars, and 3 changes of queen is a bit like trying to organize a house that's just survived an earthquake, has termites in the walls, and still has to host fancy guests every night. In other words, an absolute mess, and it kind of smells. The moment she took the throne, Mary was faced with a harsh truth. The machinery of court was deeply divided. One half followed Protestantism, trained in Reformation ideals during her brother Edward VI's rule. The other half remained loyal to Catholicism but had lost influence after years of suppression. Mary, as you might expect, chose the latter. And to do that, she needed one thing: control. Parliament and Mary's subtle game. One detail often forgotten is that Mary wasn't a tyrant from the start. On the contrary, in her first year as queen, she was extremely cautious. She didn't enforce Catholicism with brute force right away, but through laws, parliament, and a touch of royal persuasion. She summoned Parliament and asked them to reinstate the law recognizing her parents' marriage, effectively declaring herself legitimate once again. And you know what? Parliament passed it. Easily. Because at that point, Mary was widely supported a rightful queen, replacing years of chaos. Then she pushed further, restoring the anti-heresy laws that had been abolished. This time there was more noise, but still, they passed. Part of her success was that Mary didn't act alone. She had a circle of advisors, led by Cardinal Reginald Pole and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, men of sharp minds, deep experience, and devout faith. They knew how to craft laws that sounded reasonable, even if their goal was to drag people to the flames. Alliance with Spain, dream, and nightmare. In foreign policy, Mary placed all her bets on her connection to Spain. In truth, she had no better options. She married Philip II, and with that, bound England to the largest Catholic empire in Europe. On paper, it was a golden alliance. England would be protected by Spain, and Philip would help Mary restore the faith across the land. But in reality, it was like hoping your lover would move in, only for them to visit briefly and spend the rest of the time at their mother's place in Madrid. Philip didn't stay long, and when he returned in 1557, he came bearing a request. "My country's at war with France. Mind if I borrow England for a bit?" Mary agreed. And what happened? England lost Calais, the last remaining English foothold in France, held since the days of Edward III. It wasn't just a strategic failure. It was a blow to national pride. Mary nearly collapsed. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't receive visitors. And even on her deathbed, she whispered, "When you open my heart, you'll find Calais engraved on it." Truthfully, if you've ever lost all your data because you forgot to back it up, you might understand the feeling. Economics and finance, a glimmer at the end. Amid all that chaos, you might be surprised to learn that Mary actually did well in one area: financial reform. She ordered a review of the tax system, cut wasteful spending, and most notably, began addressing the collapsing currency system caused by metal debasement. With the advice of experts like Sir Thomas Gresham, Mary's policies helped stabilize the national economy and laid the foundation for the revival of naval and trade power that would blossom under Elizabeth. Which means, though remembered for the fire, she also left behind a few strong bricks for the future. But was she happy? The answer, you probably guessed it, is no. Mary lived in suspicion. She trusted almost no one outside her inner circle. She feared coups, feared poisoning, feared that her sister Elizabeth was pulling the strings behind every rumor. At one point, she forbade Elizabeth from leaving the palace and had her closely watched. And then, as illness began to dismantle her body, swelling in the abdomen, blackened skin, relentless headaches, no sleep, no appetite, politics slipped from her grasp like water leaking from a cracked glass. Mary had once wanted to be the queen of faith, but her reign passed in whispers, in fire, and in fear, more than love. And perhaps the most terrifying thing for someone who had been abandoned, who had been pushed out of history, is to be remembered the wrong way. If you're still awake, still hearing the slow turn of the fan, still curled beneath a thin blanket, then now it's time we widen the map to a place of sea routes, stretching across empires, where every royal marriage was a quiet declaration of war, and where every decision Mary made shook not only England, but all of Europe. Because ruling a kingdom is hard, but maintaining its position amid a continent ablaze with religion, war, and imperial ambition is nearly impossible. Relations with Spain, a chessboard where Mary was just a pawn. We already know Mary married Philip II, son of Emperor Charles V of the Habsburg Empire. But here's a crucial detail. This marriage tied England into European politics in a way no one expected. Imagine this. Philip wasn't just Mary's husband, he was also the heir to the largest empire in Europe. The Habsburgs didn't just control Spain, but also the Netherlands, Naples, Belgium, parts of Italy, and held immense influence in the Holy Roman Empire. So when Philip arrived in England, he didn't come as a mere consort. He came as a superpower entering your home, bringing with him a suitcase full of potential wars. And indeed, only a few years later, Mary's England was drawn into a war against France, Spain's age-old enemy. Many historians believe Mary didn't truly want to be deeply involved in the Franco-Spanish conflict, but she was bound by the marriage treaty and by her desperate desire to please Philip, whom she still called mi amado señor in her letters. This sparked growing resentment within the English court, especially among nobles already weary of costly continental entanglements. The result? The disaster of Calais, England's final territory in France, lost after nearly 200 years of possession. A stain not just militarily, but on national pride. Relations with France. from cold to confrontational. From the beginning of Mary's reign, relations with France were tense. Francis, the French king, supported Protestant factions and refused to recognize Mary as the legitimate queen. Instead, France leaned toward Lady Jane Grey and later Elizabeth, whose mother, Anne Boleyn, was an English noblewoman with no Spanish ties. But tensions truly escalated after Mary's marriage to Philip. To France, this meant England could become a Spanish base during the Wars of Religion. That night in Europe, everyone dreamed of maps being torn apart. France responded by supporting uprisings within English territory, especially in Scotland, where Mary Stuart, the French king's granddaughter, was rising to power and maintaining close ties with Paris. In several secret documents, historians have found evidence that France once plotted to provoke Protestant factions in England to rebel, hoping to overthrow Mary and install a queen more sympathetic to France. Sounds like the plot of a spy thriller, but this is history, just without a soundtrack. Only handwritten letters and wax-sealed secrets. Relations with the Pope and the Vatican, a sacred and strategic restoration. One of Mary's greatest ambitions was to restore ties with the Vatican, which had been severed ever since her father, Henry VIII, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Under Mary's reign, England returned to the Pope's flock. Cardinal Reginald Pole, a close ally of Rome, was sent to England as the papal legate and also became Archbishop of Canterbury. But don't imagine the Vatican welcomed Mary back with open arms like a prodigal child. Pope Paul IV, who succeeded during this period, despised the Habsburgs and therefore disliked Philip, Mary's husband. And as you know, in politics, marriage is just another form of entrapment. So even though Mary devoted herself to faith, her relationship with the Vatican remained awkward and ambiguous. This left Mary in a bind. Trying to please both God and her husband, she found herself trapped between two powers, neither of which fully trusted her. Relations with Scotland and Ireland, a quietly burning hearth. To the north, Scotland remained a constant threat. Though Mary's reign saw no major war, border unrest simmered. The Protestant faction in Scotland, supported by France, viewed England with suspicion, especially as Mary Tudor intensified her crackdown on heresy. Ireland was another enduring headache. Although Mary did not personally oversee its suppression, her government continued colonial policies that sparked scattered uprisings and prolonged tensions, some of which lasted well into the 20th century. A curious detail: during Mary's reign, Catholic rites were once again performed openly in Dublin, the first time in over 20 years. This led many Irish people to regard her more favorably than later monarchs, especially Elizabeth I, who would be remembered as an enemy of the Irish nation in collective memory. A lonely position on the chessboard of power. In the grand game of European power, Mary held no pieces. She was a piece, and perhaps one that was moved too early. She had faith, but lacked flexibility. She longed for unity, but acted through division. And though she loved Philip, she became a pawn in the hands of a distant empire. During her reign, England did not expand its territory, did not grow its navy, and did not claim any resounding victories. But she did something else. She kept the country from descending into civil war. In an era where religion and power clashed violently across the continent, that was an achievement few truly credit her for. And perhaps, in the quiet of that map, Mary sowed the seed of something she would never live to see: a united England, even if not the one she prayed for. Have you ever heard the sigh of a commoner? Not the vague sigh of traffic or phone bills, but the sigh of a mother as her son is led to the stake for refusing to renounce his faith. The sigh of a blacksmith when bread prices rise and the church demands another soul tax. The sigh of an entire generation living under a reign where faith and politics blended so tightly, no one knew whether to kneel before God or the crown. That was England under Queen Mary I. Bread, firewood, and the worries of everyday life. For the common people, those who bore no Tudor name and never sat in the secret councils of castles, Mary's reign was a time of confusion and fear. First, the economy. Though Mary enacted effective financial reforms at the administrative and upper levels, ordinary citizens still struggled with rising prices. The root cause was long-standing inflation carried over from Henry VIII's time, when coinage was debased with base metals, and it remained unresolved. A loaf of bread could double in price within a few months. Harvests were unpredictable. The years 1555–1557 were recorded in many rural areas as the years of hunger. And if you've ever stretched thin soup to replace dinner at the end of the month, you've tasted a small part of that experience. Each winter, thousands froze to death. Wood was expensive, coal even more so. Some small towns began organizing public burns, not of people, but of timber, to provide warmth for the poor. Faith, but not by choice. The greatest problem wasn't the price of rice or the lack of a warm coat. It was the control over belief. Under Edward VI, the people had grown accustomed to hearing Mass in English, reading the Book of Common Prayer, praying to a God without priestly mediation. But when Mary took the throne, the entire religious system was reversed. Mass returned to Latin. Churches were required to restore icons, church bells rang in the old rhythms, and anyone not attending Catholic services became suspect, even heretical. People lived in constant fear. Some were arrested just for reading the Bible in English at home. Others were reported by neighbors for not kneeling long enough. In some schools, children were forced to memorize Catholic prayers, even if their parents were devout Protestants. There were families split in faith, fathers clinging to the old religion, mothers converted to the new, and children afraid to say anything at all. The dinner table became a place of cautious glances. You might think that sounds far away, but truly, it's not so different from households today, where politics is the topic no one dares bring up. Peasant life, still the plow, the millstone, and a bit of despair. In the countryside, life didn't shift as rapidly as in cities, but the burden of taxes and rent still pressed heavily on the shoulders of peasants. Small farms were often required to pay Holy Land taxes to the church, a form of religious rent. Under Mary, with Catholicism restored, many previously dissolved churches were re-established, and along with them came the medieval tax system. It meant that peasants worked not just to feed themselves, but to sustain the church and atone for the sins of their heretical ancestors. One record from 1556 in Norfolk tells of a man whose entire harvest was confiscated for failing to pay church tax. When he protested, the answer he received was, "The will of the Blessed Virgin is not subject to bargaining." You might laugh, but he did not. Entertainment? Well, there was some. Amid the political smoke and the decrees from the Holy See, the people still tried to live. There were still festivals, traveling jesters, dances around the maypole, where village boys and girls twirled ribbons and linked arms beneath spring skies. Mary, contrary to her cold image, allowed folk festivals to continue as long as they contained no heresy. It brought some light into the darkness, even if only a flickering candle in a long night. However, whenever a celebration got too big, too lively, church watchers would be sent to observe. A puppet show could be banned if the puppet mocked a priest's accent. A folk song might be deemed subversive if the tune sounded too much like a Protestant hymn. So, people learned to laugh in silence and celebrate under watchful eyes. The ending, held in breath. In Mary's final years, as her health failed and the world seemed to dim with her, the people began to wait, not for bread, not for victory, but for a new reign. No one dared speak it aloud, but everyone knew Elizabeth was waiting, and everyone sighed, not necessarily out of hatred for Mary, but because they were tired. Tired of a time when even living required the right kind of belief. Under Mary's rule, people didn't live to dream. They lived not to be burned. And perhaps, in the long span of England's history, hers was one of the saddest eras, a time when even prayers needed approval. And then, if you lift your head above the weary crowd in the marketplace, if you pass through the thick oak doors and walk deeper into the heart of the palace, you'll arrive at the place where Mary lived. Not on the throne, not in councils of state, but in windless rooms with dim light, where time drifted slowly with the footsteps of servants and the sound of morning bells. This is where Mary Tudor truly lived, not as a symbol, but as a frightened woman, longing for love, desperate to believe that God was still with her. Walls that keep secrets. St. James's Palace and Hampton Court were among the places Mary often stayed. But no matter how many gilded ceilings or grand halls, she chose to live in small, curtained rooms. The faint light that made it through narrow windows fell only on statues of saints and the old crucifix left to her by her mother. They said Mary feared the wind, partly because of her worsening arthritis, and partly because she believed cold drafts were death breathing at her neck. Each night, servants warmed her bedding with coal pans. Sometimes they rubbed her hands with wine, infused with herbs before sleep, not to cure her illness, but to chase away the nightmares she never spoke of. A queen who didn't like banquets. Unlike the dazzling image of previous Tudor monarchs, Mary hosted few grand feasts. In surviving records, her dinners were humble: thin soup, boiled chicken, toasted bread, and watered red wine. She didn't eat much. Servants recalled how she often let food go cold in front of her, eyes fixed on some distant space, as if whispering to someone no longer there. One strange, little-known detail: Mary kept in her room an empty chair, draped in red velvet, placed right beside her bed. She called it Mother's Chair. No one was allowed to sit in it. No one could dust it without first saying a prayer. You see, some people, no matter how powerful, are just children still waiting to be held one more time. Moments of loneliness filled by ritual. Mary's daily routine rarely changed, as if repetition was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. 5 Menace. She woke and prayed alone in her room. 6 a.m. Attended Holy Mass in the Royal Chapel. 8 a.m. Breakfasted alone. 9 a.m. to noon. Received ministers, but only when her health allowed. Afternoon. Short walks through the corridors, weather permitting. Evening, more Mass, followed by solitary rosary prayers, sometimes until late into the night. What's notable is this: even when completely absent from matters of state, Mary still demanded that priests conduct daily services in her chambers. On some days, 3 masses, one at dawn, one at noon, and one at sunset, as if she were trying to hold onto every last ray of faith dimming around her. Letters without reply. One of Mary's saddest habits was writing letters to Philip. So many letters. Her handwriting, steady, slightly slanted, every line touching the sorrow she couldn't speak aloud. In them, she called him my dearest lord or my son. She wrote of stomach pains, of villagers weeping during Mass, of dreams in which she held a child. And Philip, he replied rarely and coldly. Once, after weeks of silence, Mary sent him a letter, accompanied by a lock of her graying hair. A gesture both romantic and desperate. Then she waited. There was no reply, no thank you, no sign he had even opened the envelope. If you've ever sent someone a long message and watched those 3 little dots typing only to receive nothing, you've tasted a fraction of that ache. Servants, physicians, and the fear of betrayal. Despite living in a palace, Mary trusted almost no one. Her attendants were changed frequently. At times, only 3 people were allowed to enter her chambers: an elderly nun, a letter scribe, and an old Spanish physician. She feared being poisoned. Every meal was pre-tasted. She drank only from a personal goblet placed beside a holy relic. Some nights, she made her servants pray aloud in the hallway to keep the devil from entering. Rumors spread that she heard whispers in the walls. Sometimes, she would cry out, "No, not my child, don't take it away." No one knew who she was speaking to. Perhaps the child who never came. Perhaps her mother. Or maybe herself. And finally, a queen behind glass. When her illness worsened, Mary no longer left her room. The palace continued. Ambassadors arrived. Affairs of state were discussed. Succession plots thickened. But the place where she lay was silent as a monastery. It is said that in her final days, she requested a holy mirror be affixed to the ceiling above her bed. Each day she stared into it, as though waiting for a door to open, not to escape, but to be taken. She had once ruled a kingdom. But in her last months, Mary's world shrank to a few square meters. A bed, an empty chair, a handful of candles, and a heart that had never been loved enough. You see, many die by sword, by flame, by war. Mary died slowly, day by day, within velvet walls and absolute silence. And perhaps it is in those rooms, not on the scaffold, that we can fully grasp the terrifying solitude of a woman given power but never granted peace. And then, one morning, the palace bells did not ring. The maids did not dare open her door early. They stood silently in the corridor, where the candles had begun to burn out. No one wanted to be the first to enter. Not out of fear of Mary, but fear of witnessing something colder than death: abandonment. But wait. Don't rush to the final moment just yet, because before that, there was still a Mary who lived, a Mary who breathed, a Mary who existed between silks and the ghosts of memory. The final days, a queen without a crown. By 1557, just a year before her death, Mary no longer ruled by strength. She ruled through paper, seals, and other people's hands. She rarely appeared in public, and council meetings had to be moved into her bedroom. Can you imagine it? A room half-lit, half-shadowed, filled with the scent of herbal oils and decaying flesh, where fur-clad advisors stood hunched over discussing taxes, wars, and who would succeed the crown. Meanwhile, Mary lay still, eyes half-closed, only occasionally opening them to ask, "Any letters from Spain?" And each time, the answer was the same. Number. There were none. Those around her and those who left. One by one, those close to her began to withdraw. Philip hadn't written in a long time. Cardinal Pole, her last religious ally, fell gravely ill. Those who once pledged loyalty quietly began reaching out to Elizabeth, her sister, the one everyone now watched as a beacon of salvation. Only a few loyal maids remained, praying silently with her each morning. They no longer changed the bed linens out of routine, but because of the overwhelming odor from unhealed sores on her back and thighs. One night, one of them recalled Mary crying softly, not from pain, but because she heard the whispers of the children who were never born coming from beneath the pillow. If that doesn't chill you, perhaps you've never longed to be a mother with every ounce of your soul. The final rites, faith still burning, though the body was spent. Even when she could no longer rise from bed, Mary insisted on daily mass in her chambers. The candles were always lit. Incense always burned. The holy statues were wiped clean each morning. In her lucid moments, she clutched her mother's crucifix, Catherine of Aragon's, so tightly her fingers bruised. Each night, the maids had to pry it from her hand while she slept, and each morning, she would ask for it again. By now, the court was preparing. Priest discreetly asked about her will. Officials whispered to Elizabeth in the shadows. Spanish ambassadors sent urgent letters. If possible, try to keep the crown in Catholic hands. But Mary said nothing. Even knowing everything was slipping away, she never uttered words of surrender. Not to the throne, not to Philip, and especially not to God. One night, rain fell hard. It lashed against her chamber windows. A maid claimed Mary suddenly sat up, gasping, her hand trembling as she pointed to the ceiling and cried out, "I see her! Mother's standing there!" No one else saw anything, but no one dared say otherwise. They only bowed their heads and prayed, because perhaps Catherine had truly come. Or at the very least, in her final hour, Mary allowed herself to believe that her mother had never left her. A throne no one Saturday upon. Mary Tudor's final days were like a mournful symphony, each cough ringing like a farewell bell. She had once imagined restoring the faith, giving birth to a prince, uniting England, glorifying her Spanish lineage, and carrying on her mother's legacy. But it all crumbled. What she left behind was a weary kingdom, a cold palace, and a legacy distorted into the name Bloody Mary. And yet, if you're still listening to me at this moment, as night thickens around your room, remember, Mary was not merely a failed queen. She was a woman, lonely, loyal, and desperate to be loved until the very end. And if that doesn't move you, perhaps you've never been branded by history with a name you didn't deserve. And then, as the first light of dawn slipped past heavy curtains, as birdsong was drowned by the soft tread of footsteps on cold stone floors, the palace sank into a strange silence, not the hush of sleep, but the stillness of death. Mary Tudor was gone. No dramatic sobbing. No one collapsed in royal grief, as tales so often tell. The maids stood quietly at the door. The priests fumbled their crosses. One of them whispered, "Requiescat in pace," short, gentle, more like an exhale than a prayer. And that was it. A life ended like a breath, disappearing into the morning mist. A room full of traces. The bed where she lay, once the center of royal power, of hope, of desperate prayers for a child, now held only dried bloodstains and the stench of rot seeping into the wood. Servants were ordered to change the sheets, fumigate the room, remove every crucifix and holy image. Everything Catholic had to be cleared quickly, for everyone knew Elizabeth was coming. That room, once occupied by a woman who believed she was chosen by God, was now sealed off like a cursed relic, as if even the walls wished to forget the moans, the muttered words of delirium, What did people say? Inside the palace, banners were quietly changed, the old Catholic emblem replaced by a neutral symbol. Priests ceased Latin prayers. English hymns rang out once more, as if time had turned back to before 1553. Outside, the public received the news with an emotion hard to name. Not sorrow, not exactly relief, more like a quiet exhale. As if a storm that had raged all winter had finally passed, even though everyone knew the rooftops had not survived it unscathed. Later, historians wrote, "England did not weep for Mary, but neither did it rejoice. A death neither glorious nor shameful, just an ending that everyone had been waiting for." And Elizabeth walked in. Only hours later, a rider galloped to Hatfield with news. Elizabeth, Mary's sister, daughter of Anne Boleyn, once considered a heretic, was summoned to return. When she stepped into the palace, no tears were shed for the sister who had died. But Elizabeth paused at Mary's chamber door, staring inside for a long time. No one knew what she was thinking. No one dared ask. Some say she murmured, everything she did, she believed was right. A recognition, a regret, or simply a way to say goodbye without having to speak it out loud. Then she turned away. From that moment, Mary was no longer a person, but a legacy. A name to be rewritten. A lesson to be reshaped. The funeral or a formal silence. Days later, Mary was laid to rest. There was no grand procession, no statue, just a lead-lined coffin carried by a handful of wagons moving quietly through the fog. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, beside the sister who would one day be hailed as the greatest queen in English history. Two women, one died amid whispers, the other lives forever in glory. On their shared tombstone, it reads, partners in throne and grave. But there is something strange. Elizabeth's name is gilded in gold, bright and clear. Mary's is carved into the stone, dull, sunken, almost unreadable, as if even history itself would rather no one remember. The one no one wrote poems for. Throughout her reign, Mary wrote more letters than she received, and when she died, no poem was written to bid her farewell. No ballad was sung for the Queen of Faith. No verses praised her courage, as they once did for Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth. Not because she wasn't worthy of remembrance, but because of the fear that lingered around her name. A fear not of Mary, but of what she represented, a legacy turned into a curse. Those who didn't attend the funeral, no noble from Edward's court came to mourn. No cardinal from Rome sent a letter of condolence. Philip II, the man who once held her hand in a marriage between two empires, did not return. They said he was occupied with war in the Netherlands. Others said he simply didn't want to look back at a chapter he had long tried to forget. The face that was forgotten. A nun once recorded that a sketch artist had been invited into Mary's room during her final hours to capture her likeness one last time. But the drawing was never displayed, never turned into a painting, never placed in a gallery. Only a charcoal sketch, blurred and folded inside a prayer book, rotting with time. They said the eyes in the drawing were half closed, but tilted just slightly, and you might see them still trying to open, searching for someone in the dark. The fracture of silence. There is a fine crack in the marble floor where Mary's coffin once lay. A narrow split, the length of her body, like a wound that was never sealed. Clergy under Elizabeth once suggested repairing it, but no one dared touch it. One priest reportedly said, "That is the sorrow of stone, and some sorrow should be left alone." If you listen a little closer, do you hear it? Not the wind, not the echo of heels on stone, but a whisper from behind the thick walls of Westminster where two names are carved into a shared slab, but only one shines in gold. A whisper not from the living, but from someone who was once a daughter, once a queen, once the only woman in English history to defy her age and lose. A whisper still searching for an unfulfilled dream. "Mother, I'm still here." The dream's never spoken. A nun's journal mentions that in her final weeks, Mary sometimes mumbled in Spanish, her mother's tongue, not to pray, but to dream aloud. Fragments: a child breastfeeding, a golden wheat field, a white wedding dress never worn. She never shared the full stories, but each morning, she would sit in silence for a long time, as if trying to reclaim the last broken piece of a world that had vanished. The locked box in the desk. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, she ordered a one-time inspection of Mary's chambers. Everything was searched: drawers, letters, seals. In an old oak cabinet, they found a small velvet box, locked tight. Inside, a broken silver comb, a faded letter from Catherine, and a wooden crucifix with a single Latin phrase, Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. Elizabeth did not keep the box. She ordered it buried with Mary, and no one spoke of it again. The last woman to leave the room. A palace legend says that the final person to leave Mary's chamber was an old servant named Agnes, once a maid to Catherine of Aragon. She was said to have wiped Mary's forehead, pulled the shroud over her, then turned and touched the empty velvet chair by the bed, the one Mary had called Mother's chair. And she whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore. Your daughter has come home." Then she left and never returned to court again. Is history justice? Years after Mary's death, Elizabeth's chroniclers rewrote her into something else, a fanatic, a shadow meant to be erased by light. And perhaps, in that silence, you'll hear something. Not the sound of fire, not the echo of blood, but the voice of a heart that waited too long to be remembered by another name, Mary the Faithful. And now, as every candle has gone out, the story of Mary has drifted far away to a place where time no longer ticks, where no one kneels to prove loyalty. Perhaps there, Mary walks down a final corridor, no longer wearing heavy robes, no longer followed by shadows, only bare feet on cold stone, and her mother's lullaby echoing from a world without darkness. Are you still awake, or have your eyes already closed? Either way, I hope that sleep comes to you gently tonight, like the whisper Mary never heard. You've done enough, now rest. Sleep well. We'll meet again in another story. When the moon rises and the wind taps gently at your window,